Thank you very much. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the Virginia Historical Society and the World Affairs Council of Greater Richmond, as well as the League of Women Voters, and Ambassador Randolph Bell and Paul Evingood in particular for extending this kind invitation. As Ambassador Bell noted, the first public event held by the World Affairs Council I was privileged to speak at, although I was frightened to find out that was back in '96. It just seems so recent. It's always good to be back with the World Affairs Council and to be here for the first time addressing a gathering also of the Virginia Historical Society. Few would have imagined actually back in 1996, when the World Affairs Council was formed, that within less than a decade of that time, the United States would have invaded and occupied the second most powerful and significant Arab country, historically speaking, Iraq. Nor that it would have done the same to a second Islamic country further east in Southwest Asia, Afghanistan. Nor that one would hear open talk of an American attack, or perhaps an attack by America's ally Israel, on two other important Middle Eastern nations, Iran and Syria, the latter of which actually was bombed in September of 2007 by Israeli planes flying over the airspace of America's other major ally in Southwest Asia and a little teeny bit of Europe, that is to say Turkey. As for America's other allies in the regions, one wonders who would have predicted in 1996 that Jordan would have risen to be, at least for some years, the second highest recipient of American aid in the world, or that the Saudis would have, as they announced last week, added a female member to their consultative council. Notice I didn't say a parliament yet, in the era of spreading democracy to the Middle East. Nor would one perhaps have guessed in 1996 that the formerly disgraced Israeli politician Ariel Sharon would have been dubbed a, quote, man of peace, yet at the same time Israel invading the West Bank in 2002, southern Lebanon in 2006, and Gaza most recently. Nor perhaps would one have predicted the mounting criticism over America's relationship with its other great ally in the region, Egypt. Indeed, much seems to have changed since the era of the foreign policy of President Bill Clinton and that of President George W. Bush. Now that we are entering what some believe will be a markedly different era of foreign policy between the United States and the Middle East, one wonders what kinds of comments we might find appropriate tonight as we look at the question of America's flawed partnership with Egypt. The Arab world's largest country, a major country in the Islamic world, and Africa's third most populous nation. Really, the question that I want to look at this evening in this talk, which is entitled The United States and Egypt, Perspectives on a Flawed Partnership, is, are these recent concerns and criticisms about America's relationship with Egypt, are the problems that underlay these concerns merely the results of policies and fissures that have emerged because of the Bush administration's controversial foreign policy toward the Middle East, or in fact, is the basis for these problems that currently exist in the American-Egyptian relationship, in fact, the logical result of several decades of policies and attitudes on the part of both parties. Problems that have been there for a long time, but for whatever reason seem to rise to the surface only recently. I would argue, in fact, the latter. And this evening in my comments, I'd like to explore this further, first by allowing me as a historian to trace the nature of America's interest in Egypt, in Egypt's interest in having America as an ally, followed by a brief examination of what some of the problems, or as I will call colloquially, the glitches in the relationship between the United States and Egypt, as well as an analysis of where we stand today, and again return to that question: could these problems have in fact been predicted, or as some would say, were they merely the result of the Bush administration's rather controversial policies toward the region? First, to trip down the historical memory lane, what issues or what strategic needs did the United States see as beneficial in having Egypt as an ally? By way of reminder, despite the involvement, in fact, of the American CIA in the overthrow of the Egyptian monarchy in 1952 and the coming to power of President Jamal Abdel Nasser, in fact, and a brief thawing of relations during the Kennedy administration, by and large, the United States had a fairly tense relationship with Republican Egypt until the era of Anwar Sadat in 1970. Since that year, America has courted Egypt and been courted by Egypt. And surely in those days of the Nixon administration, America's main interest in Egypt was to remove the Arab world's major military power from its confrontational position with Israel and remove it from its alliance with the Soviet Union, and instead to use Egypt's military, economic, cultural, and diplomatic prestige in the Arab world and the wider Islamic world to further American goals in the region. Certainly, as for peace, this was certainly something that was arranged. In fact, even at the funeral of President Nasser in September of 1970, the new president, Anwar Sadat, summoned the American representative at the funeral, a sort of mid-level representative, and stated his indication that he wanted to improve relations with the United States. Certainly, as for using Egypt and trying to woo it away from confrontation with Israel, of course, we all know that in the administration of President Carter, President Carter actively worked to bring reconciliation between Egypt and Israel, certainly at the Camp David summit in September 1978, and that later led to the first full-blown peace treaty between Israel and an Arab country signed on the White House lawn in March of 1979. Thereafter, until this very hour, American forces have constituted a goodly percentage of what are called the multinational force observers in the Sinai between Israel and Egypt. That's one part of the Middle East where peace between two countries is not being monitored by UN forces, but in fact by a separate organization. As for America's wider concerns with the Cold War, of course, Sadat expelled Soviet advisors even prior to the era of President Carter in 1972. And after 1979, indeed, America replaced the Soviet Union as Egypt's major foreign ally. So quite early, in fact, in this new relationship with Egypt and the United States, two of the major goals of the United States strategically, that is, removing the threat of Egypt from Israel and taking Egypt out of the orbit of the Soviet Union, had been achieved.